Hi there. I'm going to take you through some of the historiography for the Cuban Missiles Crisis. We're going to have a look at some of the traditional American and Soviet interpretations and consider perhaps also some of the kind of Cuban perspective as well. A lot of the notes on this PowerPoint came from a research paper by Rakeval Fitzgerald, and she is working out of Oxford University when she made these notes. So a lot of the notes come from those ideas that were developed in her research paper. So kind of looking at the early stages of the Cuban Missile Crisis after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s, really, of course, it's the American view that dominates in the West and certainly even in the East to some extent, because, of course, by 1964, Khrushchev has really been pushed out of the picture due to events in the Soviet Union. And, of course, for Khrushchev, the Cuban Missiles Crisis contributes to his downfall. I mean, these early kind of writers really see it as a total triumph for Kennedy, that he's had a lucky escape, it's American bravado. But we also know from our studies now later on that Kennedy perhaps wasn't as sure as confident as he seems, but certainly the quarantine seems like a kind of pretty dangerous thing to do, particularly if there had been a confrontation with a Soviet ship. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were really prepared to go to quite significant lengths to avoid the nuclear war. Really, the kind of wild card definitely is Castro. And as the crisis goes on, recent information has revealed that Castro really felt that Khrushchev didn't have the courage to kind of go to deal with the Americans. We see that as the Soviet ships turn around from the blockade and those kind of nervous telegrams that are sent in the exchange. Castro writes to Khrushchev to try and reassure him that the Cuban people are prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, that they will, defend themselves, that they will fight America if needs be, if they can count on Soviet support. And Khrushchev, quite clearly horrified by the prospect, really, tries to rein Castro back in. But the issue is now the nuclear missiles are on Cuban soil. There are Soviet officers. Whether or not they would have been launched under Castro's orders is a pretty big what if. But certainly it seems in the early 1960s, as the first kind of stories of the Cuban Missiles Crisis are written up, that it is definitely a big win and a big score for the Americans. And these traditional interpretations largely come from the people who were in the room at the time, particularly one of Kennedy's closest advisors, Arthur Schlesinger, who writes extensively on this time period. So we're also stuck with the people in the room justifying their position and justifying the choices that they made at the time. We often see that really Kennedy is responding here, that he's acting against the kind of provocation, and certainly we see that in the quarantine speech that Kennedy makes when he talks about them not simply being there for defensive purpose, which is of course what Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, was trying to tell Kennedy in the middle of October 1962. The blockade is usually praised as, Kennedy kind of calming down the hawks. People like Maxwell Taylor in the meetings that they had, trying to sort of push back the General Chiefs of Staff with their ambition for kind of all-out nuclear strikes. But at the same time, a tough policy that does not ignore Soviet and Cuban actions in America's backyard, as it were. So as I said earlier, it's Schlesinger really that is the main leader of the field, and he certainly writes a very fawning book. And we have a look at the date, 1965. It's published just a couple of years after Kennedy's assassination, and Schlesinger was Kennedy's personal special assistant during the White House years, and he really talks about Kennedy's leadership kind of dazzling the world. So you definitely got high praise indeed, and John F. Kennedy here is singled out for his ideas and his kind of creative solution to the problem. The other really big contributor to this kind of early historiography is Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother, and his book, 13 Days Memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis, is well read, well worth a read actually, and certainly has also been made into a film. And remember, it was Robert Kennedy's advice. He definitely encouraged President Kennedy to go for the quarantine. I would say to you that Robert Kennedy's memoir was heavily edited, and it does end up making JFK seem tougher than he probably was. For example, when it comes to Robert Kennedy's, proposal to bring in one of the Soviet ambassadors to sort of trade off the Cuban missiles for American missiles in Turkey, this is really portrayed as a very loose promise rather than the explicit deal that was made between JFK and Khrushchev. So certainly the memoir toughens up the actions of President Kennedy, but certainly I would suggest to you it's probably pretty much the standard American interpretation, and certainly the one that's kind of crept most into popular media and popular depictions of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In terms of the Soviet Union, really it's been very limited up until 1991. Really the only source of much information for Western historians certainly was Khrushchev's memoirs and the letters that he'd written to the USA. Those confused telegrams don't necessarily really help him. Most of the things are very propagandistic, and it's really very limited, and as you're beginning to see, it's not necessarily that straightforward to even establish why the missiles were on Cuba in the first place and what Khrushchev's real thinking was about it. And that's certainly something that you can begin to explore and investigate for yourselves. Really, one of the things that kind of comes through a lot with revisionist interpretations is a kind of mistrust of Kennedy, and that his actions are pretty reckless, that the blockade could provoke a confrontation and it could bring about a nuclear war. One of the things that happens, again, remember at this time, mid to late 60s coming on, and certainly by the early 1970s, there really is this understanding that the nuclear balance, remember the USA still had numerical superiority of nuclear weapons, that the strategic balance would not really be affected by putting Soviet missiles into Cuba. Remember, as we looked before when we looked at the off-the-record meeting, it was to do with the time the missiles would take to arrive. So revisionists will talk about Kennedy's aggression, that he was risking nuclear war over no more of a threat to US security than having missiles placed in Arctic Russia. So really that's where he was coming from, and that Kennedy should have worked far more through diplomatic channels, through the United Nations, for example. Again, this idea perhaps that diplomacy would result in a perception of weakness. If the US tries to negotiate, then they're treating the sort of Castro regime as equal, and that could certainly weaken the US's position on the world stage, creating danger for the West in the future. One of the other factors that a number of revisionist historians bring up is that the midterm congressional elections were due in November 1962, and it might be also suggested that Kennedy was very keen to kind of appear tough given those political, kind of domestic political issues were coming up. The main kind of leader of this was a guy called T.G. Patterson, who he's published quite widely, and he's written, this is a quote from the Virginia Quarterly Review, he looks at kind of President Kennedy's sort of ambition to score a victory and to score points off Khrushchev, and that he wanted to kind of really, he was very concerned with the domestic political way that it would play out with those congressional elections coming up, and that he really didn't give Khrushchev enough chance to kind of wriggle out or save face. As time moves on then, as we moved into kind of post-revisionism in the kind of 1980s, and certainly with the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, there's a much more kind of holistic view coming through, and certainly putting the Cuban Missiles Crisis into context, Bay of Pigs, Operation Mongoose, and certainly looking at perhaps JFK's reputation and kind of talking back those aggressive hawks that had been part of his sort of cabinet meetings in the early days of the crisis. Is quite possible now, particularly if you're thinking about Bay of Pigs and Operation Mongoose, with the way that the US was behaving was, and again this thinking back to kind of Castro's behaviour, those kind of activities certainly suggested to the Cuban leadership that an American invasion was imminent and that the Soviet missiles would be well placed on Cuba. The United States had been bent on liquidating, on ending the Cuban Revolution. They'd acted in a counter-revolutionary way since 1959. We've got clear evidence of that with Bay of Pigs and the numerous wide-ranging CIA activities that were going on in Cuba to discredit the Castro regime. I think certainly the Soviet government, and remember Khrushchev, he does have that idealistic streak. He is a dreamer, that they wanted to defend the Cuban Revolution. Remember, the Soviet Union is still desperately looking for allies. They really are still alone in the fact that they don't have a good relationship with China, the only other country really that's had an organic communist revolution. I mean, you can't talk about the satellite states of Eastern Europe as having spontaneous communist uprising. So again, really Cuba is another chance for the Soviet Union, a new friend, a new opportunity. It's all gone wrong with the Chinese. Perhaps now Khrushchev can do better with the Cubans. So it's very important, and Khrushchev, is very determined to protect the Cuban Revolution. That's a clear priority for him, and he communicates that very clearly to the Soviet ambassador to Cuba, Alexander Alexeyev. So that's another kind of big factor playing out, particularly for Khrushchev in terms of the sort of global view of the issue. Of course, everybody's favourite post-revisionist is Gaddis, and we now know covers extensively the Cuban Missile Crisis, and well worth a read there. Again, as I said earlier, Khrushchev is a believer. He's an impulsive guy, as we know, and he certainly is an avid fan of the Cuban motivation. I mean, certainly, I think that Kennedy and Khrushchev actually appear to be the cooler heads. It's Castro that definitely seems to be the variable and the wild card, really, that he's kind of really quite unpredictable. But certainly what we also see, what post-revisionism and the post-revisionist work really reveals, is that lack of communications breakdown, a panicked military decision, and really in all of the three countries, who's in charge of the military, who's making the decisions on the ground, really could have caused some very serious problems. So one of the other good consequences, I suppose, of the Cuban Missiles Crisis, which certainly most of the post-revisionists point out, is that stronger controls are presented. We have better communications between the leaders, and certainly now there is definitely a break again for Khrushchev and for Castro, and again the Soviet Union is not necessarily shown to be the leader of the communist world that it might aspire to, and yet again it's another dent for Khrushchev's reputation with the Chinese, and certainly the Cubans and Castro also feel let down. So the main interpretations really are a shifting view from American glory with the traditional point of view. We have a revisionist point of view which talks about, Kennedy's pretty intense behaviour, and finally the post-revisionists who will, I think, you can argue, give you a wider perspective and take into account perhaps some of the circumstances and conditions and not just the personalities of the three guys who are making the decisions. Thanks for listening.